Every year, tens of thousands of people march to the scenic village of Oosterbeek to commemorate one of the largest disasters in British military history, Operation Market Garden. It's the summer of 1944. The Allies have just successfully landed on the European mainland and are advancing through the continent at a breakneck pace. One after another, major cities fall into Allied hands. On August 25th, Paris is liberated. Brussels is freed on September the 3rd, and the all-important port of Antwerp is captured intact the following day. Spirits were high, the Germans were on the run, and it seemed like nothing could stop the Allied advance. The war, they all believed, would soon be over. But not all was well in paradise. There were heated discussions within the Allied leadership on how to proceed. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower favored a broad and steady advance. His most senior staff members, British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and American General George Patton, both argued for a single narrow advance that could crush all German resistance at once. Of course, they both believed that they themselves should be the one leading that advance. In a desperate attempt to get Eisenhower on his side, Montgomery presented an ambitious and daring plan. Operation Market Garden. The Supreme Commander was impressed by the British Field Marshal and gave Montgomery his full support. The plan, daring enough to convince even Eisenhower, consisted of two major operations. The first, Market, involved dropping paratroopers over 3 key Dutch cities, where they would capture and hold vital bridges. These bridges would pave the way for Garden, a massive ground offensive that would march north straight through Holland. Specifically, the American 101st Airborne Division under Major General Maxwell Taylor would drop just north of Eindhoven and capture several key bridges over canals near Son and Veghel. The 82nd Airborne Division under Brigadier General James Gavin would land near Nijmegen and take bridges over the Maas and Waal. The British 1st Airborne Division under Major General Roy Urquhart, supported by the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade under Major General Stanislav Sosabowski, would drop near Arnhem and take the Grand Prize, the bridge across the Rhine. This entire airborne operation totaled 34,600 men, 1,736 vehicles, and 263 artillery pieces, making it by far the largest airborne operation in history at that point. In fact, the operation was so large that the British Air Force did not possess enough planes to carry all these troops in one go, so transport had to be split into 3 separate lifts, each leaving on consecutive days. To plan this gigantic operation, the 1st Allied Airborne Army Command had little more than a single week. Capturing these bridges allowed 30 Corps, under command of Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks, to dash north through Holland and cross the all-important Rhine River, the last natural border standing between the Allies and the German heartland. Once the bridge was crossed, they could turn east into Germany, first taking the Ruhr, the heart of German industry, before advancing all the way into Berlin. This operation could, Montgomery promised, end the war before Christmas. If you were paying attention in history class, you will have heard countless of leaders promise to end their war before Christmas. Very few of them have ever actually succeeded in fulfilling this promise, and Montgomery would not be one of this lucky few. The entire operation depended on speed. The lightly armed airborne troops were not expected to be able to hold their positions for very long, so it was vital that 30 Corps advance as quickly as humanly possible. According to the plan, they had to reach Arnhem, almost 100 kilometers away, within 2 days. In planning, the Allies expected to face little resistance. The Germans had been on the run and disorganized ever since the Allies had landed in Normandy and appeared to be in no fighting shape. And this assumption might have been true just a month ago, but the Germans had not been sitting idly by, waiting for the Allies to strike. They were conducting their own preparations. General Gerd von Rundstedt had been pulled out of forced retirement and put in charge of defending the Western Front. Von Rundstedt was a famed strategist and had been involved in developing the Blitzkrieg strategy earlier in the war. Helping him was Field Marshal Walter Model, who was nicknamed the Fireman due to his reputation of putting out fires and stabilizing unorganized situations. Together, they got to work on creating order out of the chaos in Western Europe. They installed General Kurt Student at the Albert Canal in northern Belgium, where he collected any German troops he could find fleeing from the Allied advance. This resulted in a patchwork army consisting of men from widely differing units. Their defenses were further bolstered by men from Gustav von Zangen's 15th Army, who had previously been trapped at a peninsula north of Antwerp but managed to escape. Ironically, von Zangen and his men would have been completely cut off from the rest of Germany had the Allies moved only slightly north after capturing Antwerp. This advance was halted to give priority to Operation Market Garden. But perhaps the biggest boost the Germans received in their preparations came by complete accident. Model had designated Eindhoven and Arnhem as safe cities, where German battalions could come to rest and be refitted. This resulted in the presence of 2 entire SS Panzer divisions in Arnhem. Scattered intelligence of much stronger German presence in the Market Garden area had reached the British, but it was dismissed out of hand. Several Allied commanders had doubt about the operation, but nobody wanted to be the one to rock the boat. And so, Market Garden went ahead as planned. On Sunday the 17th of September, 1944, Hundreds of airplanes set off from the UK, carrying thousands of troops and vehicles to their drop zones. Despite facing much heavier opposition than initially planned, Operation Market Garden started off relatively successful. In Eindhoven, the 101st Airborne managed to capture 4 crucial bridges in the area. Unfortunately, the bridge at Somme was destroyed by German defenders before it could be taken. In response, the Americans attempted to capture a backup bridge 5 kilometers west at the village of Best, but they were unable to reach the bridge before sundown due to facing heavy opposition. By the time they finally reached the bridge, it was also destroyed. There was a similar story in Nijmegen, as the 82nd again captured all but one of the river crossings assigned to them. They secured a bridge over the Maas at Gave and over the Maas-Waal-Canal at Heumen, but failed to capture the largest bridge over the Waal. The troops assigned to take Nijmegen Bridge were dropped at the Groesbeek Heights, more than 10 kilometers from the bridge itself. Gavin had decided that these heights had to be secured in order to hold their other targets, and had given it top priority. He had commanded Colonel Roy Lindquist to send his 508th Regiment to capture the bridge, but due to a miscommunication, Lindquist believed that he was to delay his attack until his other targets were secured. This delay allowed the Germans to build up their defenses around the bridge, which made it impossible to capture within the designated time frame. Still, could be worse. In Arnhem, the 1st British Airborne ran into all sorts of problems. The bulk of their troops dropped just outside the village of Wolfheze, almost 10 kilometers from their target. This meant that, as was the case with Nijmegen, they would have to fight through several kilometers of German territory before even reaching their target. Additionally, unbeknownst to them, they were landing right on top of Field Marshal Model's headquarters. Upon seeing the British drop, he immediately assumed they were there to capture him, and he fled the city with considerable haste. While Model had left, his presence meant that there were considerably more troops in the area than the British had assumed. Sepp Kraft and the 16th SS Training Battalion happened to be camped less than a kilometer from the drop zones and quickly moved to set up a defensive screen. Closer to the city, the 9th SS Panzer Division had also set up a defensive perimeter. The British had planned to send 3 parachute battalions racing towards the city to take important positions. The 1st Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel David Dobie, would follow the road north of the railway and occupy the heights of northern Arnhem. The 3rd Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel Tony Fitch, would go through Oosterbeek and take positions to the east of Arnhem, as well as assist with the capture of the bridge. Finally, the 2nd Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel J.Frost, would follow the riverside to the city center and take Arnhem Bridge, the main target of the entire operation. This bridge is now named after J.Frost, so keep an eye on him, as he will be very important to our story. Of the 3 battalions, the 1st and 3rd immediately ran into heavy German opposition and came nowhere near their target. Only Frost's 2nd Battalion, whose route was mostly undefended, managed to reach the bridge and took up positions in several buildings on its northern approach. 2 attempts were undertaken to occupy the southern end of the bridge, but all were easily beaten back by the Germans. Shortly after the airdrops, 30 Corps, spearheaded by Joe Vandeleurs Irish Guards, began their advance from Belgium. Under the cover of artillery fire, they crossed the Dutch border at around 3 p.m. Immediately, it became clear that the German opposition was far more numerous and better equipped than they had been led to believe. The Germans waited in ambush on both sides of the road and began firing upon them with their machine and anti-tank guns. 30 Corps only broke through with the help of their Typhoon fighter planes, who fired upon the hidden Germans. The British advanced, but at a much slower pace than they had planned. The schedule said that they should have reached Eindhoven within 3 hours, but by the end of the first day, they had gotten no further than Valkenswaard. They had traveled only half the distance that they were supposed to. They did eventually reach Eindhoven by noon the following day, where they learned that the Somme Bridge had been destroyed. 30 Corps engineers worked tirelessly throughout the night, and by dawn of Tuesday the 19th, they could finally move on. Meanwhile, in Arnhem, things weren't looking so good. Radio communication between the British units had broken down almost completely, which made it impossible to coordinate any large-scale attack. To make matters worse, General Roy Urquhart and his second-in-command Gerald Lethbury had gone off into the city in search of their battalions, but ran into roaming Germans along the way. Lethbury was injured, and Urquhart was forced to hide in the locals' attic for 2 days. Their absence had raised an important question back at HQ. Who should take over command of the mission? Urquhart himself had appointed Brigadier Philip Hicks, a decision that angered fellow Brigadier John Hackett, who outranked Hicks. Still, the two managed to put their differences aside and focus on the battle at hand. Hackett himself had only just arrived in the second airlift and brought desperately needed reinforcements with him. In contrast to the first lift, this second set of troops arrived in an active battlefield under heavy fire, but somehow managed to land with only minor casualties. Hicks immediately sent the newly arrived 11th Parachute Battalion and the South Staffords to Arnhem, where they joined up with the 1st and 3rd Battalion, who were still fighting to reach Frost and his men at the bridge. Frost, for his part, was still managing to hold onto the bridge, but only barely. Throughout the 2nd and 3rd days of fighting, small groups from the 1st and 3rd Battalion had managed to sneak through the German defenses and reach the bridge. With these additions, Frost's battalion now counted around 700 soldiers. Their German counterparts numbered far more and possessed tanks and heavy artillery. In earlier attacks, the Germans had simply sent wave after wave of men at Frost positions, hoping to force a breakthrough. But they quickly realized that they needed slightly more sophisticated tactics. Now, they began to systematically bombard and destroy the buildings in which the British were hiding, one by one, forcing their occupants to flee into the open where they were fired upon by German snipers. The situation was beginning to look more and more desperate. The rest of the British Airborne, now headquartered at Hotel Hartenstein in Oosterbeek, was not doing much better. They had lost countless of men trying to reach the bridge and were running low on supplies. The 3rd Airlift, which was meant to bring reinforcements in the form of the Polish Parachute Brigade, as well as much needed supplies, turned out to be a disaster. Due to bad weather in the UK, more than half of the lift could not take off. The ones that did leave had to travel without any escort planes. Miraculously, they reached the drop zone mostly intact. Unfortunately, this zone was no longer under British control by the time they reached it. The Polish landed in an active battlefield, and in the confusion, they were shot at by both sides. Their supplies landed straight into German hands. On a positive note, however, General Urquhart had finally returned to Oosterbeek after being missing for 2 days. Still, it was clear that they could not hold on for much longer, and they needed 30 Corps to reach them as soon as possible. 30 Corps had made some progress since we last checked in on them, but were still quite some distance away from Arnhem. They reached Grave in the early morning of day 3, and reached Nijmegen later that same day. They got within 400 meters of the bridge before being halted. It soon became apparent that it would be extremely difficult to take the bridge in a head-on assault, so they came up with a plan. The 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment would cross the Waal River in a boat and attack the bridge from the north. By attacking from both sides, they hoped to quickly take the bridge. This crossing would be extremely dangerous, as the river was wide and the north bank was guarded by Germans in well-defended positions. To make matters worse, it took almost a full day for their boats to arrive, which meant that they had to cross the river in broad daylight, with their only defense being a smokescreen laid down by British tanks. Still, they believed that they had no other options, and the attack went ahead. At 3 p.m. on Wednesday, September the 20th, 4 days into their 2-day operation, members of the 503rd Regiment under command of Major Julian Cook rowed across the Waal under heavy German fire. They did not have enough paddles for every man, so many had to row using the back of their rifles. Before the crossing, Cook had stated that he would lead his men like George Washington had, standing erect on the boat, clenching his fist, and driving his men forward. At the actual crossing, he sensibly let go of that idea, which was a good thing given how dangerous the operation was. They lost almost half their boats on the first crossing and 2 more in the second crossing. Despite suffering heavy losses, they crossed the river 5 more times. In total, 200 soldiers were killed, but the village of Lent on the northern bank was successfully taken. As the Germans were retreating from Lent, the first tanks of the Irish Guard began crossing the bridge. At 7 o'clock, the river crossing had been secured. Despite their success, and knowing the urgent situation Urquhart and his men were facing in Arnhem, 30 Corps decided not to advance any further that day, instead choosing to spend the night at Lent. So why did they decide to waste this precious time when they were only 15 kilometers away from their target? Well, the road between Nijmegen and Arnhem was far more treacherous than any they had traversed so far. The highway they needed to take was elevated from the rest of the terrain, which meant that any tank crossing it would be highly exposed. On top of this, there was no room for tanks to maneuver off the road at any point. Any armored division planning to traverse this island highway needed sufficient infantry support accompanying them along the way, and they did not have any available at that moment. On top of this, there was still fighting going on at Nijmegen, and they believed that they might have to defend the bridge from German counterattacks. Taking a mostly unknown road, guarded by an unknown number of defenders, in the dark of night, while leaving a vital bridge undefended, was a risk that they were not willing to take. Instead, an attack was planned for noon the following day. By the time they captured Nijmegen, the bridge at Arnhem was still in British hands, although they were just barely holding on. Throughout the 4th day, they were still enduring heavy German artillery fire, and the number of buildings they controlled kept getting lower and lower. Around noon, Frost and his men managed to make contact with mission headquarters, only to learn that they could not expect any help to come their way, as the rest of the 1st Airborne Division wasn't doing any better. By now, any attempts of reaching the bridge had been halted, as both the 1st and 3rd Battalion had been wiped out almost completely, and all remaining forces had set up a perimeter around Oosterbeek, where they would attempt to fend off the Germans for as long as they possibly could, hoping that the advancing 30 Corps could reach Arnhem in time. Not to be deterred by some bad news, Frost's 2nd Battalion kept fighting, but it was apparent to both the British and the Germans that it was only a matter of hours before they were defeated. By the afternoon, British casualties were rising, and a short truce was called to allow the wounded to be evacuated to German hospitals. After 2 hours, the fighting continued, but without Frost, as he had been among the wounded. Frederick Gough had taken over command and continued fighting throughout the night. By early Thursday morning, their final radio message was broadcast. Out of ammo, God save the King. It was only heard by the Germans. In planning, It was estimated that the more than 10,000 strong British 1st Airborne Division could hold the bridge for 2 days. In practice, only 700 men had held it for 4 days, against much stronger opposition. But it had all been for naught, as the bridge was now in German hands. This had massive implications for the fighting further south, as it allowed the Germans to freely send tanks and battalions across the bridge to engage the advancing 30 Corps. The loss of the bridge did not mean the end of British presence in Arnhem, as Urquhart and the rest of the 1st Airborne were still holding out in Oosterbeek, though their area was getting smaller by the hour. But crucially, the area they controlled contained the northern end of the ferry line crossing the Rhine. They hoped that, in lieu of a bridge, 30 Corps could instead cross the Rhine using the ferry. Although Arnhem Bridge was lost, there was still hope of successfully completing Market Garden. But if any positive conclusion was to be reached, relief had to come fast. The British position was under a near constant bombardment, and they were running out of food, ammo and medical supplies. The situation was so bad that they had to call a 2-hour truce just so they could evacuate their wounded, because they simply did not have enough safe spaces to treat them. On Friday, they got a brief break from their constant bombardment, when the rest of the Polish brigade finally parachuted down near the village of Driel, on the south bank of the Rhine. The German guns that had previously been focused on the besieged Brits now turned their attention towards the reinforcements, shooting them out of the sky. The Polish suffered heavy casualties. Of the 1,500 men in the Polish brigade, only 750 successfully landed in Driel, many of which were wounded and in no fighting shape. The British used this brief window to reorganize and reinforce their desperate positions. Shortly after they landed, the Poles were contacted by a messenger from the British holed up on the north bank of the Rhine. Private Ernst Henry Archer had swum across the river to ask the Poles to relieve them as soon as they could. When they finally reached the riverbank, the Poles found the ferry missing, and the rafts that were promised by Archer failed to arrive. With no other option left, they returned to Driel to take up defensive positions. In the following days, they made several attempts to cross the river, but no more than 250 men made it across, only 200 of which managed to reach the British positions at Hartenstein. In response to the Poles' arrival, the Germans sent the 10th SS Panzer Division towards the village of Els to cut them off. As the Poles were landing, the 43rd Wessex Infantry Division had reached the top of a now 60-mile-long column, stretching from Nijmegen all the way down to the Belgian border. With the support of this infantry division, the Irish armoured guards slowly made their way up north. Over the next days of fighting, they took several small villages, including Oosterhout, Ressen and Bemmel. But progress was slow and costly. A small cavalry division of the 43rd took a set of side roads and managed to link up with the Polish brigade at Driel. While the battle at Arnhem was raging, the Germans performed several counterattacks on the narrow Allied column. They were successful at Veghel, and they managed to completely cut off the northern half of the column for almost 24 hours, preventing supplies from reaching the battle and tying up indispensable troops trying to reopen the corridor. By Sunday the 24th, it had become clear that the situation was hopeless. Urquhart's men at Oosterbeek were only barely holding on by the skin of their teeth, and 30 Corps was making little progress. Several attempts of crossing the river at Driel had failed, and the Germans were counterattacking all over the British column. On the 8th day of this 2-day operation, the decision was made to give up the Arnhem Bridge and evacuate Urquhart's men as quickly as possible. The order to withdraw reached Oosterbeek in early Monday morning, and the evacuation was planned for the following evening, hoping to take advantage of the cover of nightfall. Even evacuating Oosterbeek was easier said than done, as it meant that troops, many of which were wounded, had to cross the river. Some boats were available, but many ended up having to swim their way across. To draw as little attention to the operation as possible, a small number of men were left behind to man the British positions, giving the Germans the illusion that the fighting was still going on. That night, the British artillery on the south bank, paired with decoy attacks, were deployed to distract the Germans, while the last of the airborne troops crossed the river towards the relative safety of Driel. Of the 10,005 men that dropped at Arnhem, only 2,163 returned. In total, Allied casualties for Operation Market Garden are estimated to be as high as 1,700, and it had all been for nothing. They failed to capture the bridge across the Rhine, most of the Netherlands remained in German hands, and the war raged on for almost a full year after. Despite this, Field Marshal Montgomery said that the operation had been 90% successful, as they had captured the majority of their objectives. But without Arnhem, these successes were worth nothing. In response, the Dutch Prince Bernard said, "My country can never again afford the luxury of another Montgomery success." Historians are a contentious bunch, and they like nothing more than arguing with each other. Market Garden is no exception. While most agree that the operation was a failure, many disagree on exactly where and why it failed. And it is easy to see why, as so many things had gone wrong at every level of the operation. People argue that the paratroopers should have been dropped closer to their targets, that Nijmegen Bridge should have been captured immediately, or that they shouldn't have delayed their advance after capturing Nijmegen. Even outside these strategic failures, luck wasn't on their side either. Bad weather meant that several airlifts had to be postponed or cancelled outright, leaving the fighters short of supplies and manpower. Many of the German defenders, including the 9th and 10th Panzer Divisions that had proved crucial in the Battle of Arnhem, were in the area by complete accident. But truthfully, the entire plan was doomed from the start. Even in the planning stage, everything had gone wrong. In their optimism, Montgomery and his advisors had assumed they would face little to no opposition, and they ignored several intelligence reports that showed the opposite. Their plan required everything to go perfectly, and that was never going to happen in the chaos of modern warfare. As Lieutenant General Frederick Browning had already told Montgomery during planning, "I think we may be going a bridge too far." Thank you for watching. I've been Thomas, and I hope to see you next video where I have an incredible offer for you. Hiya.